Two men stood on opposite ends of history's knife edge. One was cautious, sentimental, and weighed down by family loyalty. The other was fearless, brilliant, and barely old enough to shave. Together, they would gamble everything: blood, honor, and an empire, to create what later generations would call China's greatest golden age. But at the beginning of this story, they weren't heroes. They were suspects. Surrounded by enemies, trapped inside a collapsing dynasty, and hunted by a tyrant who ruled with paranoia instead of wisdom. Because before the Tang Dynasty became synonymous with poetry, power, and prosperity, it was born in betrayal, desperation, and a race against time. And the clock was already ticking. To understand how China reached its golden age, we have to rewind to a moment when the country was anything but golden. Northern China was fractured, scarred by decades of war, ruled by former nomadic elites who had settled into power but never fully stabilized it. This was a world where dynasties rose fast and fell even faster. Into this chaos was born Li Yuan in the year 566, during the Northern Zhou period. He wasn't born poor, he wasn't born powerless, but he also wasn't born safe. Li Yuan grew up surrounded by politics, ambition, and bloodline pride. His mother came from the powerful Xianbei elite, and his family connections ran deep, dangerously deep. His aunt married the man who would later found the Sui dynasty. Another close relative would become emperor himself. On paper, Li Yuan's life looked like a guaranteed rise to the top. But history doesn't reward comfort. It punishes it. Despite his connections, Li Yuan earned his reputation the hard way. He was a skilled archer, a respected commander, and a man known for emotional restraint rather than cruelty. He even won his wife's hand through an archery contest, a small detail, but one that reveals the kind of world he lived in. Skill mattered, strength mattered, bloodline helped, but only until it didn't. And Li Yuan was obsessed with his lineage. He proudly claimed descent from the prestigious Li clan of Longxi, a family that traced its roots to legendary figures, military heroes, philosophers, symbols of moral authority. Whether those claims were exaggerated didn't matter. What mattered was belief. And Li Yuan believed deeply that his family was destined for something greater. That belief would soon be tested by one of the worst emperors in Chinese history. When Emperor Yang Guang took the throne of the Sui dynasty, everything changed, and not for the better. Where his father had ruled with discipline and restraint, Yang Guang ruled with ego and excess. Rumors spread fast, whispers of patricide, executions disguised as reforms, a court drowning in luxury while the countryside bled. The emperor demanded mega projects that swallowed lives by the tens of thousands: the Grand Canal, the rebuilding of the Great Wall, forced labor on a scale that broke entire regions. And when people collapsed from exhaustion, they were replaced, not relieved. But Yang Guang's greatest failure wasn't cruelty. It was incompetence. Obsessed with military glory, he launched massive invasions against Goguryeo in Korea. The scale was unprecedented. Over 1 million soldiers, supported by millions more. It should have been a guaranteed victory. Instead, it became one of the most catastrophic failures in ancient warfare. In 612, the Sui army was annihilated. Supplies vanished. Morale collapsed. Bodies piled up, and the emperor's authority cracked beyond repair. Rebellions erupted everywhere. Peasants revolted. Officers defected. Local warlords stopped pretending loyalty even existed. The empire was rotting from the inside. Yet, Yang Guang didn't respond with reform. He responded with terror. One of his generals promised rebels mercy, then slaughtered 30,000 of them after surrender. The message was clear. Submission meant death. Resistance meant death. Survival meant rebellion. As the empire burned, Li Yuan was appointed governor of Taiwan, a critical northern command. Officially, his job was to suppress rebels and defend against the Eastern Turkic Khaganate. Unofficially, he was walking into a trap, because the Turks were watching, waiting. And when word leaked that the emperor himself was traveling north, they struck. A massive force surrounded the imperial entourage. For a moment, it looked like the Sui dynasty would end right there, on a frozen frontier. That's when a 16-year-old junior officer changed everything. Li Shaman's second son. Young, fearless, and terrifyingly intelligent. Outnumbered and exposed, Li Shiman devised a desperate gamble. He ordered his men to display more banners than they possessed, more drums than they needed, more noise than their numbers justified. From a distance, it looked like a massive army was approaching. The Turks hesitated, then retreated. A boy had saved an emperor who didn't deserve saving. And here's the twist. At this moment, the Li family was still loyal to the Sui dynasty. Li Yuan still believed in order, in family loyalty, in stability over chaos. But Li Shiman saw something his father refused to admit. The dynasty was already dead. It just hadn't fallen yet. As rebellion spread and imperial inspectors closed in, father and son stood at a crossroads. One clung to duty, the other smelled destiny, and very soon, choosing the wrong path wouldn't just cost them power, it would cost them their entire family. Every revolution begins with a secret, and the most dangerous secrets are spoken inside families. For Li Yuan, rebellion wasn't an idea, it was a nightmare. For Li Shiman, rebellion wasn't treason, it was survival. By the year 616, the Sui dynasty was no longer collapsing quietly. It was screaming on the way down. Entire provinces had slipped from imperial control. Local warlords ruled in the emperor's name while openly defying his orders. Bandit armies swelled into full-fledged rebel states, and the roads between cities became rivers of refugees. Li Yuan watched all of this from Taiwan, a city that mattered far more than it seemed. Strategically, Taiwan guarded the northern approaches to the heartland. Politically, it was a powder keg. And personally, it was a prison. Because while Li Yuan commanded troops, his extended family was effectively held hostage near the capital. One wrong move, one suspicious letter, one careless breath, and the emperor could erase his bloodline overnight. Li Yuan knew how the game was played. He had watched relatives rise and vanish his entire life. So when his son spoke openly of rebellion, Li Yuan didn't argue. He panicked. This wasn't courage versus cowardice. This was experience versus ambition. Li Yuan understood something Li Shiman didn't yet. Rebellion wasn't just about armies, it was about timing, legitimacy, and making sure that when you struck, there was no turning back. But fate wasn't interested in Li Yuan's caution. Imperial inspectors were dispatched across the empire to find scapegoats for the Sui dynasty's failures, and one of them was heading straight for Taiwan. If the inspector discovered Li Yuan's leniency toward rebels, or worse, his private misconduct, the punishment would be immediate execution. No trial, no appeal. Li Yuan had already crossed lines he couldn't uncross. His wife had passed away, and in his loneliness he had taken concubines from within the imperial harem system, a serious violation. In a healthy dynasty, it might have been overlooked. In a paranoid, collapsing one, it was a death sentence. Li Shiman saw the writing on the wall. He didn't beg his father, he cornered him. If they did nothing, the empire would execute them anyway. If they acted, at least they controlled the battlefield. This wasn't rebellion for power, it was rebellion for survival. Still, Li Yuan hesitated. Blood ties mattered to him. The emperor was his cousin. Their families had intermarried for generations. Breaking that bond felt like tearing apart his own identity. So Li Shimen did something ruthless and brilliant. He forced his father into a position where neutrality was impossible. Using trusted allies, Li Yuan quietly spread rumors that the emperor was preparing another catastrophic invasion of Goguryeo. The result was predictable. Fresh rebellions erupted almost overnight. Communities already pushed to the edge snapped instantly. Then Li Yuan played his role perfectly. He reported being overwhelmed, overstretched, in desperate need of reinforcements. Permission was granted for his officers, including Li Shimen, to conscript troops from surrounding districts. On paper, it was an imperial order. In reality, it was the birth of a private army. At the same time, secret envoys were dispatched to rescue Li Yuan's relatives from the capital. This was the most dangerous move of all. If even one courier was caught, everything ended immediately. And some were caught. Not all family members could be saved. Several remained trapped under imperial watch. Li Yuan knew that once he crossed the final line, their lives would almost certainly be forfeit. This was the moment that broke him. The sentimental family man, the careful governor, the loyal cousin, disappeared. In his place stood something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. In early 617, Li Yuan officially raised his banner, not as a rebel, not yet, but as a protector of the empire, claiming his mission was to remove corrupt officials and restore proper governance. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was strategy. Open rebellion invited immediate annihilation. Moral justification invited allies. Local commanders defected quietly. Rebel leaders pledged support. Former bandits suddenly found themselves wearing uniforms and marching under banners that claimed imperial legitimacy. And at the center of it all was Li Shimen. Young commanders often overreach. Li Shimen did the opposite. He studied enemies. He exploited terrain. He avoided unnecessary battles, while striking decisively when it mattered. Every victory attracted more followers. Every restraint made him look reasonable instead of reckless. But the Suri court finally understood the truth. Li Yuan wasn't suppressing rebellion, he was becoming it. The emperor panicked. Orders were issued to crush Taiwan. Elite forces were mobilized. Time was running out. Li Yuan now faced an impossible choice. Advance toward the capital or be surrounded and destroyed. Marching south meant open war against the dynasty he once served. Standing still meant death. History often pretends these moments are dramatic speeches or divine revelations. In reality, they are quiet decisions made at night when no one is watching. Li Yuan chose to march. As his army moved, banners spread a single message across northern China. Not conquest, not revenge, restoration. But behind that message lay something far more radical. The end of the Sui dynasty was no longer a possibility. It was a countdown, and Li Shimen, still not even 20, was about to prove that this rebellion wasn't just justified, it was unstoppable. The moment Li Yuan's army began marching south, the lie was over. This was no longer restoring order. This was a direct challenge to the Sui dynasty itself, and everyone from rebel leaders to imperial generals understood what that meant. Only one side would survive. As Li Yuan advanced from Taiwan, the political theater intensified. Official proclamations were carefully worded. He claimed loyalty to the dynasty. He claimed the emperor had been misled by corrupt ministers. He claimed his goal was protection, not replacement. But armies don't march on words alone. They march on belief, and belief was spreading fast. Across northern China, commanders faced a brutal calculation: remain loyal to a failing emperor who no longer protected them, or gamble on a rising force led by a respected governor with elite bloodlines and a disciplined army. Many didn't even wait for orders. They defected preemptively. Li Yuan welcomed them carefully. No mass executions, no reckless purges. Every surrender reinforced his image as a stabilizer rather than a destroyer. This wasn't accidental, it was deliberate statecraft. Yet, the real engine of this campaign wasn't Li Yuan. It was Li Shimin. Where his father governed perception, Li Shimin mastered the battlefield. He led from the front, but never blindly. Every engagement was calculated, every risk measured. He struck where enemies were weakest, withdrew before being trapped, and turned minor victories into psychological disasters for opposing forces. Imperial generals underestimated him constantly. They saw his age and assumed inexperience. What they faced instead was a commander who understood momentum better than men twice his age. One by one, Sui strongholds fell, not always through force, but through fear. Garrisons surrendered rather than fight him. Rumors exaggerated his brilliance, his courage, his inevitability. In civil war, reputation kills as effectively as swords. But the greatest obstacle still stood ahead. Chang'an. The old capital wasn't just a city, it was a symbol. Whoever controlled Chang'an controlled the narrative of legitimacy, and it was heavily defended. Li Yuan hesitated again. Taking Chang'an meant crossing the final line. There would be no return from that act, no reconciliation, no plausible deniability. Li Shimin didn't hesitate. He understood something essential about history. Legitimacy isn't claimed, it's seized. The assault was swift, precise, and devastating. Instead of grinding through prolonged siege warfare, Li Shimin exploited weak points, coordinated attacks, and internal defections. The city fell faster than anyone expected, and with Chang'an captured, the illusion collapsed. Li Yuan did something brilliant and deeply cynical. He did not immediately declare himself emperor. Instead, he installed a puppet child emperor from the Sui royal family, ruling as regent. This move shocked everyone. It reassured hesitant officials. It neutralized ideological resistance, and it bought time. Behind the scenes, the Sui dynasty was already dead, but on the surface it still breathed, long enough for Li Yuan to consolidate power without provoking universal opposition. Meanwhile, Emperor Yang Guang was far away, isolated, paranoid, and rapidly losing control. His authority meant nothing outside his immediate entourage. When news reached him, it wasn't anger that dominated. It was disbelief. He had underestimated everyone, especially the Li family. As months passed, support drained from the Sui court like blood from an open wound. Governors defected. Supplies vanished. Assassinations multiplied. Finally, the inevitable happened. In 618, Emperor Yang Guang was assassinated by his own generals. The Sui dynasty ended, not with thunder, but with betrayal. Li Yuan wasted no time. The puppet emperor was quietly removed. Rituals were performed. Proclamations issued, and Li Yuan ascended the throne as Emperor Gaozu of Tang. A new dynasty had begun. But here's the truth: history often smooths over. The Tang Dynasty was not yet secure, not even close, because revolutions don't end when the crown changes hands. They end when rivals are eliminated. And Li Yuan had many rivals. Warlords across China claimed legitimacy. Former allies became competitors. Men who had helped overthrow the Sui now wanted their own dynasties. The empire was unified in name, but fractured in reality. This was when Li Shimin became indispensable. While Emperor Gaozu ruled from the throne, Li Shimin led campaign after campaign against rival states. He crushed some through battle, absorbed others through negotiation, and eliminated the rest through sheer military brilliance. By his early 20s, Li Shimin was the most successful general in the empire. Too successful, because success breeds fear. Inside the Tang court, tensions rose. Li Yuan had multiple sons, and succession was never just about merit. It was about survival. Li Shimin's older brother was the crown prince. Officially, he stood above him, but unofficially, everyone knew the truth. The army trusted Li Shimin. The generals followed Li Shimin. The empire had been built on Li Shimin's victories, and that made him dangerous. Whispers began circulating through the palace. Plots, counterplots. Silent alliances forming behind silk curtains and closed doors. The greatest threat to the Tang Dynasty was no longer external, it was internal. Father and son had overthrown a dynasty together. Now the question hung in the air like a drawn blade. Could the Tang survive its own success? Or would the very man who helped create China's golden age be forced to destroy his own blood to protect it? That answer awaited at the gates of a place called Xuanwu. Every golden age is forged in fire, but the fire that nearly consumed the Tang Dynasty didn't come from foreign invasion or rebel warlords. It came from inside the palace walls, from brothers raised under the same roof, from a father who loved peace more than confrontation, and from a silence so heavy it made murder feel inevitable. By the early 620s, the Tang Dynasty existed, but it was fragile. China was technically unified, yet the scars of civil war were still raw. Armies remained mobilized, borders were restless, and power, real power, did not sit calmly on the throne. It followed Li Shimin. He had done what no one else could. He defeated rival regimes that threatened to split China apart again. He crushed warlords who claimed imperial titles of their own. He stabilized the empire through decisive military genius, and that made him terrifying. Li Yuan, now Emperor Gaozu, wanted peace. He wanted rest. He wanted to enjoy the dynasty he had helped create, but the court whispered constantly that the empire's survival depended on the wrong son. The crown prince, Li Jianchun, had the title. Li Shimin had the loyalty of the army. This imbalance was fatal. Every court session felt tense. Every banquet felt staged. Every smile hid suspicion. Li Jianchun feared his younger brother, not without reason. In imperial history, generals who saved dynasties often ended them too, and Li Jianchun's reputation only grew. Meanwhile, Li Shimin knew something even more dangerous. He knew the rules. In Chinese dynastic politics, there were no second chances. If you lost the succession struggle, you didn't retire. You were erased. At first, both sides maneuvered quietly. They built alliances among ministers. They placed loyalists in key positions. They spread rumors carefully. Li Yuan tried to mediate. He issued warnings. He reshuffled offices. He hoped compromise could hold. But compromise doesn't survive fear. Li Jianchun and his ally, another brother named Li Yuanji, began plotting openly. They attempted to strip Li Shimin of military command. They pushed to have him reassigned, far from the capital, and when that failed, darker options emerged. Assassination was discussed. Li Shimin knew. Information flowed to him from officers, servants, even palace guards. Every warning pointed to the same conclusion. If he waited, he would die. History often portrays decisive figures as cold and ruthless. But in reality, the most dangerous decisions are born from desperation. Li Shimin didn't want to kill his brothers, but he understood that sparing them would doom the dynasty and himself. So he chose first strike. The location was Xuanwu Gate, a northern entrance to the palace complex, a place of routine movement, a place where guards changed shifts, a place where history could be rewritten in moments. Li Shimin planned carefully. He secured loyal troops. He ensured key guards were sympathetic or silent. He anticipated every move his brothers might make. On the morning of the ambush, Li Jiancheng and Li Yuanji were summoned to the palace under false pretenses. They sensed danger, but turned back would confirm guilt. As they approached Yuanwu Gate, arrows flew. Li Jiancheng was killed almost instantly. Li Yuanji tried to flee. Li Shimin pursued and executed him personally. In minutes, the Tang succession was decided in blood. But the coup wasn't finished. Li Shimin rushed to confront his father. Emperor Gaozu was stunned. His sons were dead. The palace was under control of one man. The dynasty he had built was now at risk of tearing itself apart from within. Li Shimin knelt. He did not boast. He did not threaten. He presented the situation as already decided. Chaos had been prevented. Stability preserved. There was only one path forward. Li Yuan understood the truth immediately. Resisting meant civil war. Supporting Li Shimin meant survival. Within days, Li Shimin was declared crown prince. Within months, Li Yuan abdicated. In 626, Li Shimin ascended the throne as Emperor Taizong of Tang. This moment marks one of the most dramatic power transitions in Chinese history. A son who saved a dynasty then seized it. A father who yielded to preserve peace. A family tragedy that laid the foundation for a golden age. But here's what makes this story extraordinary. Instead of ruling through fear, Taizong ruled through reflection. Haunted by what he had done, he became obsessed with avoiding tyranny. He listened to criticism. He invited dissent. He encouraged ministers to argue with him openly, even harshly. He reformed the legal system, reduced punishments, lowered taxes, relieved forced labor. Where the Sui dynasty had collapsed under excess, the Tang stabilized through restraint. Taizong studied past dynasties obsessively. He examined why they rose, why they fell, and he recorded his own mistakes, so future emperors could learn from them. This was unprecedented. Under his rule, China entered a period of internal stability and external strength. Borders expanded, trade flourished. Foreign envoys flooded Chang'an, turning it into the most cosmopolitan city on earth. But Taizong never forgot how fragile power truly was. He once said that an emperor is like a man rowing upstream. Stop rowing, and you drift backward immediately. That philosophy defined the Tang Golden Age. Yet even at its peak, danger never vanished. Succession issues loomed again. Court factions never disappeared, and prosperity itself carried new risks. Because the brighter the dynasty shone, the longer its shadow grew. The Tang Empire had reached its height, but history is never static. And the question was no longer how the Tang rose, but how long it could stay on top before the same forces that destroyed the Sui came back for it. Power is easiest to seize in chaos. it is hardest to hold in peace, and Emperor Taizong understood this better than any ruler before him. When he took the throne, China expected another cycle of bloodshed, another paranoid emperor, another purge. That was the pattern history had taught them. But Taizong broke it, and in doing so, redefined what imperial power could look like. Instead of ruling from fear, he ruled from memory, the memory of rebellion, of civil war, of brothers dying at a palace gate. That trauma shaped every decision he made. Taizong surrounded himself with men who disagreed with him, not flatterers, not yes-men, but critics. Men who reminded him daily that unchecked authority destroys dynasties. The most famous of them was Wei Zheng, a former enemy, a man who had once served Li Jiancheng, the brother Taizong had killed. By every political rule, Wei Zheng should have been executed. Instead, Taizong promoted him. Why? Because Wei Zheng spoke uncomfortable truths. He criticized policy openly. He challenged imperial decisions in court. And when Taizong grew angry, Wei Zheng didn't retreat. He doubled down. Ministers expected Wei Zheng to be executed weekly. Yet, Taizong protected him fiercely. He once said that a mirror shows a man his appearance, but honest ministers show an emperor his soul. This philosophy transformed the Tang court. Policies were debated openly. Military expansion was questioned instead of glorified. Economic reforms focused on sustainability rather than spectacle. Taizong dismantled the excesses that had destroyed the Sui. Forced labor quotas were reduced. Taxes were lightened. Legal codes were revised to emphasize fairness over terror, and the people felt it. Farmers returned to abandoned land. Markets reopened. Population rebounded. For the first time in generations, stability felt real. But Taizong didn't stop at internal reform. He understood that China's strength depended on how it handled the world beyond its borders. The Tang Dynasty did something revolutionary. It didn't isolate itself. It opened outward. Chang'an became the beating heart of Eurasia. Merchants arrived from Persia, Central Asia, India, Arabia, and beyond. Languages mixed in its markets. Religions coexisted. Ideas flowed freely. Buddhism flourished alongside Taoism and Confucianism. Foreign customs were not just tolerated. They were admired. This wasn't weakness. It was confidence. Militarily, Taizong was just as calculated. He defeated the Eastern Turkic Khaganate not through brute force alone, but through alliances, intelligence, and psychological dominance. When the Turkic leader was captured, Taizong spared him and absorbed his people into the Tang system. Former enemies became soldiers. Former rivals became governors. The message was clear. Resistance was futile. Submission was rewarded. By the mid-7th century, the Tang Dynasty controlled territory larger than almost any Chinese empire before it. And yet, there was no mass terror, no empire-wide purges, no paranoia-driven massacres. This balance made Taizong legendary. But golden ages are deceptive. They make stability look permanent. They lull societies into believing success is self-sustaining. Taizong knew better. As he aged, his thoughts turned to succession. And here, history began to repeat itself. He had sons, talented sons, ambitious sons, and he knew exactly what unchecked ambition could do. Determined to avoid another Zhongwu Gate, Taizong tried to manage succession carefully. He appointed heirs, removed them when they faltered, replaced them again. Each change sent ripples through the court. Factions formed. Ministers aligned themselves quietly. The same dangerous patterns emerged. Even the greatest rulers cannot fully escape human nature. When Taizong died in 649, he left behind something extraordinary: a stable empire, a functioning bureaucracy, a legal and moral framework stronger than any individual ruler. And that may have been his greatest achievement, because what followed did not collapse immediately. His successors inherited a system, not just a throne. Under Emperor Gaozong and later rulers, the Tang continued to thrive. Art exploded. Poetry reached heights never seen before. Figures like Li Bai and Du Fu would later define Chinese literary identity forever. Technology advanced. Woodblock printing spread. Trade networks expanded even further along the Silk Road. The Tang Dynasty became the cultural reference point for East Asia. Japan modeled its court after Tang institutions. Korea adopted Tang legal codes and artistic styles. Even centuries later, Chinese people would refer to themselves as Tang people. But history always collects its debt. As generations passed, the discipline T-zone enforced softened. Court luxury crept back in. Military governors gained regional power. Central authority weakened. Slowly, quietly, and then came a Lushan, a general of mixed heritage. Charismatic, trusted, and dangerously powerful. His rebellion in 755 would shatter the illusion of Tang invincibility. Millions would die. The empire would survive, but never fully recover its former strength. Yet even after that devastation, the Tang did not vanish overnight. It endured for another century and a half. Because golden ages do not disappear instantly, they fade. The Tang Dynasty's legacy wasn't just conquest or wealth. It was an idea that power could coexist with restraint, that openness could strengthen an empire, that culture could be as influential as armies. All of it traced back to one impossible partnership: a cautious father, a fearless son, a dynasty born from chaos and tempered by reflection. And as the Tang slowly declined, one truth became impossible to ignore. The Golden Age was never about perfection. It was about balance, and once that balance was lost, history moved on, just as it always does. A Golden Age doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It sneaks in quietly, disguised as routine, until one day the world looks back and realizes everything changed. That was life under the early Tang after Emperor Taizong's death. The machinery he built kept moving, almost effortlessly, and for a brief rare moment in history, China felt balanced. Order existed without suffocation. Authority ruled without terror, and prosperity didn't yet carry the stench of decay. Taizong's successor, Emperor Gaozong, inherited more than a throne. He inherited a system designed to restrain emperors themselves. The bureaucracy functioned. The laws were clear. The economy was strong enough to absorb mistakes. For a time, it worked. Gaozong was not a genius like his father, but he didn't need to be. The Tang machine carried him forward, and China continued to flourish. Population rose, farmland expanded, trade caravans flowed like arteries feeding the empire's heart. Chang'an became the most international city on earth. Its streets echoed with foreign tongues. Persian merchants negotiated silk prices. Indian monks debated philosophy. Arab traders mapped new routes westward. No other empire at the time absorbed the world so confidently. The Tang did not fear outside influence. It consumed it, refined it, and made it its own. This openness became one of the dynasty's greatest strengths, but it also planted seeds of vulnerability that would take decades to sprout. Culture exploded. Poetry was no longer just an elite pastime, it became a social currency. Officials were judged by their verses as much as their policies. Calligraphy, painting, music, and fashion all reached new heights. The Tang court set trends that rippled across East Asia. To be civilized was to imitate Tang China. This was soft power on a scale the ancient world had never seen. But beneath the elegance, the structure slowly shifted. Military power began drifting away from the center. To defend vast borders, the Tang relied on regional commanders called jidushi. At first, they were rotated frequently to prevent local loyalties. Over time, convenience replaced caution. Commanders stayed longer. Armies answered to men, not institutions. The very efficiency that made the empire strong began loosening its grip. Then history took a turn no one expected. A woman stepped into the center of power. Wu Zetian did not rise gently. She climbed through palace intrigue, calculated alliances, and ruthless elimination of rivals. When she finally claimed the throne, she didn't rule as empress consort. She ruled as emperor in her own right. The only woman in Chinese history to do so. Traditional historians despised her. They painted her as monstrous, unnatural, illegitimate. But the truth is more complicated and far more uncomfortable. Wu Zetian was brutally effective. She expanded the examination system, weakening aristocratic dominance. She promoted capable officials regardless of birth. She stabilized the state during transition. Yes, she used spies. Yes, she eliminated enemies. But so did nearly every male emperor before and after her. What made her unforgivable wasn't cruelty. It was success. Under her rule, the Tang system evolved. The bureaucracy became more merit-based. The empire remained stable, but the cost was psychological. Court politics became darker. Surveillance normalized. Trust eroded. When Wu Zetian eventually fell, the throne returned to the Li family. But something fundamental had changed. The innocence of the early Tang was gone. The empire still looked strong. In fact, it reached its territorial peak shortly afterward. But power was no longer evenly distributed. The center depended increasingly on military governors who commanded personal loyalty. Wealth concentrated in elite families. Court factions hardened. The balance Taizong had obsessed over began to tilt. And then came An Loshan. He was everything the Tang system had accidentally created. A frontier general of mixed heritage. Charismatic, militarily brilliant, trusted with enormous power, he commanded multiple regions and hundreds of thousands of troops. The court saw him as a loyal pillar of stability. They were wrong. In 755, an Alushan rebelled. The shock was immediate and devastating. His armies swept through the north, capturing key cities with terrifying speed. Chang'an fell. The emperor fled. What followed was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Entire regions were depopulated. Famine spread. Records suggest tens of millions died, though exact numbers are impossible to know. The Tang eventually crushed the rebellion, but victory came at a horrific price. To survive, the court relied even more heavily on regional commanders. Autonomy increased. Central authority weakened. Permanently. The empire stood, but it limped. This was the moment the Golden Age truly ended, even if the dynasty itself did not. Poetry continued. Art survived. Trade recovered, but the confidence was gone. The Tang would exist for another century and a half, but it would never again command the same unquestioned authority. And yet, here's the paradox. Even in decline, the Tang remained extraordinary. Its institutions outlasted its power. Its culture outlived its borders. Its ideas traveled farther after its peak than during it. Later dynasties would imitate Tang's system, Neighboring states would preserve Tang traditions long after China itself moved on, because golden ages are not defined by how they end, they are defined by what they leave behind. The Tang Dynasty left behind a vision of empire that balanced strength with openness, authority with restraint, ambition with culture. It proved that power did not have to suffocate creativity, that stability did not require isolation, that an empire could be feared and admired at the same time. All of it began with a desperate gamble by a cautious father and a fearless son, and all of it unraveled when balance gave way to convenience. History doesn't punish empires for ambition. It punishes them for forgetting why they succeeded in the first place. After the An Lushan rebellion, the Tang dynasty entered a strange new phase of existence. It was still alive, still ruling, still magnificent on the surface, but something vital had been lost. The empire now moved like a wounded giant, powerful enough to frighten its neighbors, yet internally fragile, dependent on compromises that quietly undermined everything Emperor Taizong had once worked to prevent. The court returned to Chang'an, but the city no longer felt invincible. The emperor sat on the throne again, yet real authority was fractured. Regional military governors, the Ji-du-shi, had saved the dynasty during the rebellion, and now they expected payment. That payment was autonomy. They collected their own taxes. They commanded their own armies. Some passed their positions to sons as if ruling private kingdoms. The Tang emperor was still supreme in theory, but in practice power had become negotiable. This shift changed the character of the empire. Earlier Tang emperors ruled through persuasion, legitimacy, and institutional strength. Now they ruled through balance of power politics, constantly mediating between rival generals, court factions, and entrenched aristocratic families. Every decision carried risk. Favor one group too much, and another might rebel. Punish a governor too harshly, and an entire region could erupt. Yet culture did not collapse. In fact, it flourished in unexpected ways. The trauma of rebellion reshaped Tang art and literature, giving it emotional depth that earlier prosperity had not required. Poets wrote not only about wine and moonlight, but about loss, exile, and moral exhaustion. Difu wandered through war-torn landscapes, recording suffering with painful honesty. His poetry became the conscience of an empire that had seen too much blood to pretend innocence. Li Bai, his contemporary, represented the other response to decline. He wrote of freedom, intoxication, and cosmic beauty, as if refusing to let reality crush the human spirit. Together, these poets captured the soul of late Tang China, an empire still brilliant, still creative, but haunted by what it had lost. The court itself became more insular. Aristocratic families tightened their grip on high office. Examination success increasingly favored those with resources and connections, despite the meritocratic ideals of earlier generations. Corruption grew quietly, not as open tyranny, but as entitlement. Officials assumed the empire would endure simply because it always had. Meanwhile, new threats emerged on the borders. The Tibetans pressed from the west. Nomadic powers reorganized in the north. The Tang still possessed strong armies, but coordination was difficult when loyalty was divided. Victories became temporary. Peace treaties became more expensive. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Some were capable, others were weak. A few were dangerously distracted. None possessed the combination of authority, intellect, and moral restraint that Taizong had embodied. Each reign chipped away at central power just a little more. Then came another corrosive force: eunuch domination. Originally palace servants, eunuchs gradually took control of the imperial guards. Whoever controlled the guards controlled access to the emperor. By the late Tang, eunuchs could install and depose emperors at will. They decided successions. They silenced opposition. They turned the palace into a battlefield of intrigue, where survival mattered more than governance. This development terrified scholar officials, but they were powerless to stop it. Protests failed. Reforms stalled. The system that once checked imperial excess now found itself bypassed entirely. The emperor was still sacred, but increasingly isolated, protected, and imprisoned by the same people. As central authority weakened, rural unrest returned. Heavy taxation to support armies and court luxury pushed peasants to the edge. Banditry rose. Secret societies formed. The countryside began to resemble the final years of the Sui dynasty, a comparison that haunted Tang officials who remembered how that story ended. The final blow came in the form of massive peasant uprisings, the most devastating led by Huang Chao in the late 9th century. His rebellion swept across the empire like a storm, capturing cities, massacring elites, and exposing just how hollow Tang power had become. Chang'an fell again. The emperor fled again. History repeated itself with cruel symmetry. The Tang Dynasty did not fall immediately. Like an old tree, it stood for a few more decades, hollowed out but upright. Regional warlords carved out independent territories. The court became symbolic. In 907, the last Tang emperor was forced to abdicate. China fractured once more into competing states, and yet the Tang never truly disappeared. Its institutions lived on. Its culture became the standard by which later dynasties judged themselves. Its poetry became immortal. Its capital remained a symbol of cosmopolitan grandeur long after the dynasty itself was gone. When later generations looked back, they didn't remember the corruption, the eunuchs, or the endless compromises. They remembered the confidence, the openness, the sense that China had once stood at the center of the world, not isolated, but connected. That is the paradox of the Tang Dynasty. It collapsed because it forgot the balance that created it, but it endured in memory because, for a time, it achieved something no empire ever truly perfects: power with humanity. The Golden Age ended not with a single disaster, but with slow forgetting. Forgetting that restraint mattered. Forgetting that institutions must be defended. Forgetting that prosperity is fragile. And perhaps that is the final lesson of Tang China. Empires do not fall when they are weak. They fall when they believe their greatest age can never end. When the Tang Dynasty finally collapsed, China did not mourn it the way it mourned other fallen empires. There were no illusions left to shatter. The long decline had prepared everyone for the end. What shocked people was not that the Tang fell, but how far the world still lived in its shadow. Even as new regimes fought for dominance, they borrowed Tang laws, Tang rituals, Tang culture, and Tang dreams. The dynasty was gone, but its blueprint refused to die. The chaos that followed, known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period, looked eerily familiar. Regional warlords ruled fragments of the old empire. Alliances shifted constantly. Crowns changed hands through violence rather than legitimacy. It was exactly the kind of fragmentation that Tang had once ended centuries earlier. History had completed a full circle. Yet something was different. This time, the idea of what China could be had been permanently altered. Future rulers did not look back to the Sui for inspiration. They looked to the Tang. They studied how Emperor Taizong listened to criticism instead of silencing it. They analyzed how early Tang governance balanced military power with civilian authority. They admired how culture was elevated into a pillar of statecraft rather than a luxury. Even the failures of the Tang became lessons. The dangers of over-empowered generals, the risks of palace factions, the slow poison of forgetting institutional limits. The Song dynasty, which eventually reunified much of China, consciously defined itself as a successor to Tang ideals. It weakened military governors, strengthened civil bureaucracy, expanded the examination system further than ever before. This was not accidental. It was a direct response to Tang collapse. The Song chose safety over expansion, administration over conquest, and culture over intimidation. In many ways, it was an argument with Tang history, an attempt to preserve the Golden Age without repeating its mistakes. Beyond China, the Tang legacy spread even wider. Japan adopted Tang legal codes, city planning, court rituals, and fashion. Its capital, Heiankyo, was modeled directly after Chang'an. Korean kingdoms absorbed Tang administrative structures and Confucian ideals. Even in Central Asia, Tang coins, art styles, and diplomatic practices left lasting marks. For centuries, to be civilized in East Asia meant to be Tang-influenced. This reach explains why the Tang dynasty occupies such a unique place in historical memory. Other empires were powerful. Some were richer. Some lasted longer. But few defined cultural identity so completely. The Tang didn't just rule China. It shaped what China believed itself to be. At the heart of that legacy lies contradiction. The Tang was open, yet authoritarian, cosmopolitan, yet hierarchical, humanistic, yet born from ruthless violence. Its golden age rested on bloodshed, but its memory is dominated by poetry. That tension is not a flaw in the story. It is the story because Li Yuan and Li Shimen did not set out to create a cultural renaissance. They set out to survive a collapsing world. Everything that followed, the art, the trade, the philosophy, was a consequence of stability achieved through painful choices. The Golden Age was not designed. It emerged, and that may be why it still fascinates us. Modern audiences often imagine history as progress marching forward. But the Tang Dynasty reminds us that history is fragile, that greatness is reversible, that civilizations can reach astonishing heights and still unravel quietly, almost politely, over time. No invasion destroyed the Tang in a single blow. It eroded from within, as trust thinned and balance tipped. Even so, the Tang remains aspirational. When Chinese writers, artists, and thinkers dream of a confident, outward-looking China, they dream in Tang colors. When historians speak of cultural confidence without isolation, they point to Chang'an. When power is discussed alongside restraint, Toussaint's reign still stands as a benchmark. And perhaps that is the final irony. The Tang dynasty is remembered not because it lasted forever, but because it did not. Its fall humanized it. Its decline made its achievements feel earned rather than inevitable. It stands as proof that golden ages are not permanent states. They are moments, rare alignments of leadership, institutions, culture, and restraint. Once that alignment breaks, history moves on, but memory lingers. In the end, the Tang dynasty was more than a chapter in Chinese history. It was a reference point, a standard, a reminder that power does not have to be brutal to be effective, and that culture can be as commanding as armies. It began with a father who hesitated and a son who did not. It peaked under a ruler who feared tyranny more than rebellion, and it ended not with sudden destruction, but with slow forgetting. That is why the Tang still matters, because its greatest lesson is not how to rise, or even how to rule, but how easily the very qualities that create a golden age can be lost when no one remembers why they mattered in the first place. The Tang dynasty's story is a testament to the complexity of power. From the very first rebellion led by Li Yuan and Li Shimen, the dynasty was forged in both strategy and blood. That foundation, built on careful timing, brilliant military planning, and political manipulation, was both the dynasty's strength and eventually its vulnerability. Every victory, every calculated alliance, every decision to spare or eliminate an enemy had long-term consequences that rippled for centuries. What made the Tang so remarkable was not just its power, but the way that power intertwined with culture, morality, and legacy. Emperor Taizong's reign established a model few rulers could match. He understood that survival depended on balance between military might and civilian governance, between fear and respect, between ambition and restraint. His creation of a merit-based bureaucracy, encouragement of criticism through ministers like Wei Jing, and reforms to law and taxation created stability that allowed China to thrive internally while expanding externally. This balance became the cornerstone of Tang greatness. Yet, even as stability increased, the seeds of future instability were quietly planted. Military governors gained autonomy to protect the empire's frontiers, and while initially necessary, that autonomy would later undermine central authority. Power began to decentralize, and over time the Tang court would struggle to manage it. Culturally, the Tang Dynasty set unprecedented standards. The court encouraged poets, artists, and philosophers, creating an era that would define Chinese cultural identity for centuries. Figures like Li Bai and Du Fu captured the brilliance and the trauma of the era, reflecting both the joy and the cost of empire. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, making Chang'an the most cosmopolitan city of the era, where foreign merchants, scholars, and envoys converged. Religion thrived alongside commerce, and Buddhist, Taoist, and Confucian practices intermingled, creating a society both spiritually and materially rich. The Tang dynasty became a center of soft power, influencing neighboring Korea, Japan, and even Central Asia, not through conquest alone, but through cultural example and sophistication. Yet, no empire is immune to its own contradictions. Despite Taizong's careful balance, the structures that enabled Tang prosperity also contained vulnerabilities. Military governors, once tools of expansion and stability, became sources of power struggles. Palace intrigues, eunuch dominance, and factionalism grew quietly, eroding the cohesion of the central government. The very meritocracy that had fueled Tang administration gradually faltered as elite families consolidated power and court politics shifted toward self-interest rather than public service. Stability was no longer guaranteed. It was negotiated daily, requiring constant vigilance. These structural tensions exploded with the An Lushan rebellion. An Lushan, a frontier general trusted with immense power, rose against the very empire he had sworn to protect. His rebellion swept northern China, capturing Chaomenyan, forcing emperors to flee, and killing millions. It was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, and it marked a turning point for the Tang. Although the dynasty survived militarily, its authority was forever weakened. The rebellion accelerated decentralization, empowering regional governors even further, and it showcased the fragility that lay beneath even the brightest golden age. After An Lushan, the Tang dynasty entered a prolonged phase of partial decline. While the empire remained territorially vast and culturally influential, central authority eroded. Successive emperors lacked the combination of strategic genius and moral authority that Taizong had possessed. Eunuchs controlled the Imperial Guard, and court factions manipulated succession. Peasant unrest returned, fueled by taxation and the pressures of supporting regional militaries. Local rebellions became a recurring threat. The once balanced system teetered on the edge, dependent on personalities rather than institutions. Yet, even in decline, the Tang dynasty's cultural and institutional achievements endured. Poetry, literature, art, and urban sophistication continued to flourish. Neighboring states still emulated Tang governance, law, and customs. The dynasty's influence transcended the physical boundaries of the empire. Its legacy became an enduring standard for Chinese civilization, a benchmark for governance, culture, and cosmopolitanism. Even centuries later, to be Tang-like was to aspire to a combination of order, refinement, and openness that few other empires achieved. The Tang dynasty's rise and fall illustrate a fundamental lesson about history and power. Greatness is never permanent. Even the brightest golden age can be undermined from within by the slow erosion of balance, the concentration of unchecked power, or the failure to adapt institutions to evolving realities. The Tang dynasty survived centuries of internal and external crises, yet it ultimately fell not because it lacked strength, but because it gradually forgot the principles that had made it extraordinary. And yet, paradoxically, this very fragility enhanced the dynasty's legend. Its collapse did not erase its accomplishments. Instead, it heightened them. The brilliance of the Tang, its art, its administration, its cosmopolitan culture, remains a symbol of what is possible when vision, strategy, and talent converge. Its failures serve as cautionary tales. Its successes continue to inspire. In every sense, the Tang dynasty embodies the dual nature of empire: magnificent, mortal, and unforgettable. By the late Tang period, the dynasty had entered a complex interplay of brilliance and vulnerability. Even as poets wrote about the empire's beauty and courts celebrated the arts, the foundations beneath were quietly eroding. Regional governors, once loyal defenders of the frontier, had transformed into autonomous rulers. Their personal armies answered more to local loyalty than to the emperor. Central authority, carefully nurtured by Taizong, was slowly giving way to negotiation, bribery, and coercion. The golden age of centralized power was fading, replaced by a delicate, tense equilibrium. At the same time, the bureaucracy continued to thrive superficially. Examination systems produced talented officials, but wealth and familial influence increasingly determined real opportunity. Meritocracy was no longer absolute. It had become filtered through networks of privilege. Court factions gained power, and rivalries simmered behind closed doors. Even minor disagreements could escalate into severe political consequences. Survival required cunning as much as competence, and the stakes for misstep were lethal. Eunuchs, initially palace servants, had consolidated unprecedented authority. They controlled the imperial guards and manipulated access to the emperor. Their influence dictated succession and policy. While some eunuchs acted wisely, many exploited their position, increasing instability. The emperor, revered as sacred and untouchable, became simultaneously powerful and constrained, bound by the very individuals sworn to serve him. Trust was a rare commodity, and loyalty an uncertain calculation. Despite internal weaknesses, the Tang dynasty continued to shape culture and identity. Trade along the Silk Road remained vibrant. Foreign merchants, diplomats, and scholars still traveled to Chang'an, enriching both the economy and cultural life. Religious pluralism thrived, with Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism coexisting alongside imported traditions. The city of Chang'an remained a cosmopolitan marvel, demonstrating the Tang capacity for integration and sophistication. Its influence reached Japan, Korea, and Central Asia, leaving a lasting imprint on the political and cultural structures of the region. Yet the empire's fragility manifested most clearly in rural areas. Peasant discontent grew in response to taxation and conscription, both necessary to sustain the sprawling bureaucracy and the military apparatus. Banditry and small uprisings became increasingly common, signaling the cracks in Tang authority. Local leaders, regional armies, and opportunistic rebels exploited the weakening central power. The dynasty's earlier successes at internal stability were difficult to maintain when the institutions that had ensured loyalty were compromised. Among the many crises, one rebellion looms largest in memory: Huang Chao's revolt in the late 9th century. This peasant-led uprising devastated northern China, captured Chang'an, and forced the emperor to flee. It exposed the dangerous consequences of neglecting the balance between military, civil administration, and social welfare. Although eventually suppressed, the rebellion irrevocably weakened the central government and accelerated fragmentation. The dynasty would survive in name, but it would never again reach the heights achieved under Taizong or Gaozong. The late Tang period illustrates the impermanence of centralized power. Even an empire with unprecedented cultural, economic, and military achievements is vulnerable when authority becomes decentralized and institutions are eroded. Golden ages require more than capable rulers. They require sustainable systems, reinforced by accountability, trust, and disciplined succession planning. The Tang Dynasty achieved brilliance when these systems were intact, and decline when they were ignored. Nevertheless, the Tang legacy endured beyond the empire's physical and political limits. Its poetry and art defined Chinese cultural identity for centuries. Its administrative and legal innovations influenced subsequent dynasties, including the Song and Ming. Neighboring civilizations emulated Tang governance and ceremonial practices. Even after the dynasty's political collapse in 907, its cultural and intellectual influence remained a benchmark for what Chinese civilization could achieve. The Tang dynasty, in many ways, became a standard for governance, culture, and diplomacy across East Asia. The story of the Tang dynasty is ultimately a study in balance between ambition and restraint, power and morality, innovation and tradition. Its rise was marked by bold action, strategic brilliance, and familial complexity. Its peak was defined by cultural flourishing, economic growth, and political stability. Its decline demonstrates the fragility inherent in any system, no matter how sophisticated or successful. The dynasty's history offers timeless lessons about leadership, governance, and the consequences of neglecting the very principles that create greatness. Above all, the Tang dynasty reminds us that golden ages are rare, precarious, and unforgettable. They are shaped by individuals and institutions, by choices both courageous and ruthless, and by the delicate alignment of opportunity, talent, and vision. Once disrupted, even the most powerful empire can lose its cohesion, yet the memory of that greatness can endure far longer than the empire itself. In this duality, strength and vulnerability, achievement and loss, the Tang dynasty continues to captivate historians, artists, and dreamers, centuries after its final emperor abdicated. Even as the Tang dynasty struggled with internal fractures, its cultural heartbeat continued to resonate with unmatched intensity. The contrast between political decline and artistic brilliance became a defining feature of the late Tang period. Poets, painters, and musicians captured the tensions of an empire simultaneously at its height of sophistication and the edge of collapse. The era's literature did more than entertain; it chronicled the psychological landscape of an empire grappling with its own contradictions, prosperity shadowed by instability, power shadowed by vulnerability. Du Fu's poetry reflected these dualities with stark clarity. Wandering the countryside, he witnessed destruction and famine, the human cost of rebellions, and the fragility of social structures. His verses became a mirror, reflecting not just the material realities of the late Tang, but the emotional and moral consequences of mismanagement and ambition. Li Bai, in contrast, celebrated freedom and Madians, often retreating from harsh realities through flights of lyrical fantasy. Together, their works documented the empire's soul, one cautious, one daring, both necessary to understand the complexity of Tang civilization. Even in times of political weakness, Tang cosmopolitanism persisted. Chang'an remained a crossroads of civilizations. Merchants from Central Asia, the Middle East, and even farther west brought luxury goods, ideas and technologies. Diplomats and envoys from neighboring kingdoms, Japan, Korea, Tibet, frequented the capital, sharing knowledge, negotiating alliances, and learning from Tang administrative practices. Religious plurality thrived, with Buddhist temples, Taoist monasteries, and Confucian academies flourishing alongside foreign sects and traditions. The empire's openness became a form of awe, a soft influence that extended far beyond military might. Yet, beneath the splendor, tensions simmered. Regional governors, whose autonomy had expanded during An Lushan's revolt, continued to consolidate power. Eunuchs maintained unprecedented control over court access and succession. Court factions grew more entrenched, often prioritizing personal gain over state welfare. Peasant unrest, spurred by taxation and conscription, increasingly threatened local stability. These pressures revealed the delicate balance necessary to maintain a complex empire and foreshadowed the eventual dissolution of centralized Tang power. Huang Chao's uprising in the late 9th century epitomized the culmination of these internal pressures. His rebellions swept through northern China, captured major cities, and forced the imperial court to flee. Though eventually quelled, the rebellion irrevocably weakened central authority and further empowered regional warlords. The dynasty persisted in name only. Politically, the empire had fragmented beyond repair. These events underscore the fragility of even the most sophisticated governance structures when authority is diffused and loyalty is uncertain. Despite political collapse, Tang culture's influence endured. Later dynasties, particularly the Song, consciously adopted Tang systems of governance, law, and civil service examinations. Japan and Korea continued to model their administrative and ceremonial practices on Tang precedents. The empire's art, literature, and poetry became enduring benchmarks of Chinese civilization. Tang influence extended beyond borders and centuries, shaping East Asian culture and identity long after the dynasty itself ceased to rule. The story of the Tang Dynasty reveals an essential truth about power. The greatest empires require more than force. They require balance, foresight, and institutional integrity. The early Tang's success under Taizong and Gaozong demonstrated how military strategy, civil administration, and cultural investment could converge to create a golden age. Its decline illustrated how quickly such achievements could unravel when autonomy, corruption, and internal divisions were allowed to grow unchecked. Ultimately, the Tang dynasty's legacy is dual in nature. Politically, the empire succumbed to internal erosion, rebellion, and decentralization. Yet, culturally and intellectually, it achieved a permanence that surpassed political survival. The Tang model of open cities, thriving trade networks, cultural innovation, and merit-based administration remained a guiding standard for future rulers. Its poetry, art, and cosmopolitan ethos inspired generations across China and neighboring nations. The Tang Dynasty, therefore, is not simply a tale of rise and fall. It is a lesson in leadership, governance, and human ambition. Its story reminds us that golden ages are fragile, that the structures supporting greatness must be actively maintained, and that even the most brilliant achievements are vulnerable to neglect. And yet, the memory of the Tang's accomplishments, its beauty, sophistication, and global influence remains timeless, a testament to what a civilization can achieve when vision, strategy, and culture align. As the Tang Dynasty entered its twilight, the contrast between its cultural brilliance and political fragility became impossible to ignore. Even with weakened central authority, the empire continued to produce unprecedented art, literature, and architectural achievements. Chang'an, though periodically threatened by rebellion, remained a beacon of cosmopolitan sophistication. Its markets overflowed with goods and ideas from Central Asia, India, the Middle East, and beyond. Temples, palaces, and academies reflected a society that had mastered both beauty and bureaucracy, even as its political foundation grew increasingly precarious. The cultural flowering of late Tang was inseparable from its historical context. The experiences of rebellion, internal power struggles, and fragile governance informed the era's art and literature, giving them emotional depth that resonated with contemporary audiences and future generations alike. Du Fu's reflections on suffering, exile, and moral decay captured the human cost of imperial ambitions, while Li Bai's poetry offered an escape into imagination and freedom, celebrating the transcendent beauty of life despite its dangers. Their works embody the duality of the empire itself, magnificent yet vulnerable, thriving yet impermanent. Political instability, however, continued to escalate. The empowerment of regional military governors, a necessary solution during earlier crises, now threatened the cohesion of the empire. These Jaidushi controlled armies, collected taxes, and wielded influence that rivaled the central government. The emperor's power was increasingly symbolic, with real authority diffused across distant provinces. Palace eunuchs, empowered by access to the imperial guard, manipulated succession and influenced policy. Court factions became entrenched, prioritizing survival and personal gain over governance. This structural imbalance accelerated the decline of central authority, leaving the empire susceptible to internal and external pressures. One of the most consequential crises came with Huang Chao's rebellion. Beginning in the late 9th century, this massive uprising devastated northern China, capturing key cities, including Chang'an. The emperor was forced to flee, and millions of lives were lost. While the Tang eventually regained control, the rebellion irreversibly weakened central power. Regional governors gained even more autonomy, and the court's influence shrank. It was clear that the dynasty, though still officially ruling, had lost its former strength and stability. The empire that had once commanded awe across Asia was now fighting merely to survive. Yet, in the face of decline, Tang culture retained its extraordinary vitality. Trade along the Silk Road continued, ensuring the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies with distant lands. Neighboring states, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, modeled their administration, education, and culture on Tang precedents, ensuring the dynasty's influence persisted long after its political power waned. Art, literature, and music flourished, producing works that would inspire generations to come. The intellectual and cultural achievements of the Tang became a standard against which later dynasties measured themselves, creating a legacy that endured far beyond the fall of the empire. The rise and fall of the Tang dynasty offer enduring lessons about governance, power, and the fragility of civilizations. Early successes were achieved through a careful balance of military strength, civil administration, and cultural investment. Later decline was driven by decentralization, factionalism, and neglect of the very principles that had sustained the empire. Leadership alone, no matter how talented, could not maintain stability without robust institutions and accountability. The Tang dynasty demonstrates that the greatest achievements can be impermanent when balance is lost. Ultimately, the Tang dynasty's story is not one of simple triumph or failure. It is a story of paradox, extraordinary cultural and economic success juxtaposed with political vulnerability. It shows how golden ages can emerge from chaos and yet dissolve from neglect. It illustrates the tension between ambition and restraint, power and morality, and central authority and regional autonomy. Above all, it reveals the delicate interplay between human vision and historical forces, how leadership, institutions, and cultural values converge to create an era that continues to captivate us centuries later. Even after centuries of political collapse, the memory of the Tang Dynasty continues to define Chinese civilization. Its poetry, art, governance, and cosmopolitan ethos have left an indelible mark on history. The Tang remains a benchmark of what a civilization can achieve when vision, talent, and opportunity align. Its golden age, though impermanent, serves as a reminder that greatness is always fragile, and that the principles which sustain it must be actively preserved. The Tang Dynasty's legacy is both a celebration of achievement and a cautionary tale, proof that the brightest moments of history are never guaranteed, but can endure in memory far longer than in reality. By the late Tang period, the dynasty had become a study in contrasts. On one hand, it remained a cultural and intellectual powerhouse, producing some of China's most celebrated poetry, calligraphy, and art. Chang'an continued to attract merchants, diplomats, and scholars from across Eurasia, maintaining its reputation as a cosmopolitan hub of commerce and ideas. On the other hand, the political structure that had enabled this golden age was steadily eroding. The central government's influence diminished as regional military governors gained autonomy, and the court became increasingly controlled by eunuchs and factions, a shift that would ultimately contribute to the dynasty's downfall. The civil service system, a hallmark of Tang governance, still functioned but was no longer the purely meritocratic institution envisioned by earlier emperors. Wealth, family connections, and political maneuvering often determined who rose to prominence, diluting the system's original purpose. At the same time, the empire faced mounting social pressures. Peasant unrest, fueled by excessive taxation and conscription, grew in frequency and scale. Banditry and localized uprisings became common, signaling cracks in what was once an unshakable state. These internal pressures compounded the external threats the Tang had long managed, such as nomadic incursions from the north and conflicts with neighboring states. The most devastating internal challenge of the late Tang era was the rebellion led by Huang Chao. Beginning in the late 9th century, his revolt swept across northern China with unprecedented ferocity, capturing major cities and forcing the imperial court to flee. Millions perished in the violence, and although the rebellion was eventually suppressed, it permanently weakened the central government. The emperor retained the throne, but real power had shifted to regional authorities, who now wielded armies and controlled local resources. The Tang dynasty had survived, but it was no longer the cohesive, centralized power that had defined its golden age. Despite these challenges, Tang culture remained remarkably resilient. Trade along the Silk Road continued to flourish, allowing ideas, religions, and technologies to flow into and out of the empire. Buddhist temples, Taoist monasteries, and Confucian academies maintained their influence, while Tang art and literature continued to shape Chinese identity. Neighboring countries, Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, continued to adopt Tang political structures, ceremonial practices, and cultural norms. In this sense, the Tang dynasty's influence outlasted its political dominance, leaving a legacy that shaped East Asian civilization for centuries. The late Tang period also highlights the dangers of over-reliance on individual power rather than institutional stability. Early Tang emperors, like Taizong and Gaozong, maintained authority through a careful balance of military, civil, and cultural governance. In contrast, The later Tang relied increasingly on personal loyalty and the temporary effectiveness of strong regional commanders. This imbalance made the empire vulnerable to rebellion, corruption, and inefficiency. The very structures that had created a golden age, centralized authority, disciplined bureaucracy, and equitable administration, had been weakened, demonstrating how quickly prosperity can become fragile. Ultimately, the story of the Tang Dynasty is both inspiring and cautionary. It demonstrates how an empire can reach extraordinary heights in culture, governance, and influence, yet remain vulnerable if power becomes concentrated in the wrong hands, or if institutional balance erodes. Its golden age, born from the vision of strategic and capable leadership, was defined by creativity, openness, and cultural integration. Its decline, however, serves as a stark reminder that even the most brilliant achievements are impermanent when vigilance lapses and systems weaken. Yet, despite political collapse and social upheaval, the Tang Dynasty's cultural and intellectual achievements endured. Poetry, art, literature, and administration continued to influence generations of Chinese thinkers, artists, and leaders. The dynasty's cosmopolitan ideals and commitment to governance as a reflection of culture provided a model that transcended the lifespan of the empire itself. Even after the Tang fell in 907, its legacy became the standard against which all subsequent dynasties measured themselves, ensuring that its golden age continued to inspire and instruct long after its final emperor had abdicated. In the end, the Tang Dynasty teaches us that greatness is never guaranteed, even in moments of extraordinary achievement. It reminds us that power, culture, and prosperity must be maintained through careful balance, foresight, and institutional strength. Its story of rise, peak, and decline continues to captivate, offering lessons that remain relevant for understanding leadership, governance, and the enduring impact of cultural brilliance. The Tang Dynasty, with all its contradictions, remains one of history's most remarkable and enduring civilizations. As the Tang Dynasty entered its final century, the empire's brilliance persisted even amid political fragility. The court in Chang'an remained a center of refinement, where scholars, poets, and artists produced works that would define Chinese culture for generations. The city itself was a marvel of urban planning and cosmopolitan energy, with merchants from Persia, India, and Central Asia mingling with Chinese officials and scholars. Markets were filled with exotic goods, temples echoed with prayers in multiple languages, and the streets showcased a fusion of fashion, art, and ideas. Tang China had become a living symbol of cultural integration, an empire whose soft power rivaled its military might. Yet, beneath this outward splendor, structural weaknesses deepened. Regional governors controlled armies and collected taxes independently, creating de facto semi-autonomous regions. The emperor's influence became increasingly symbolic as eunuchs and court factions dictated policy and succession. Civil service exams, while still prestigious, were influenced by wealth and connections, rather than merit alone. These systemic imbalances made governance unpredictable, fostering instability and resentment. Even minor disturbances, once easily contained, could now spiral into widespread unrest, threatening the very cohesion of the empire. Peasant revolts and localized uprisings became common during this period, reflecting both economic strain and social inequities. The population, burdened by taxes to support distant armies and an expansive bureaucracy, began to fracture. Banditry flourished in rural areas, while cities struggled to maintain order. Huang Che's rebellion had shown the lethal consequences of ignoring these tensions, and though decades later the empire attempted recovery, the lessons were only partially heeded. Central authority remained fragmented, and regional power became the deciding factor in political survival. Even with these challenges, Tang culture continued to flourish in profound ways. Poetry reached unparalleled heights, with Du Fu capturing human suffering and moral reflection, while Li Bai celebrated freedom and imagination. Art and calligraphy remained central to social status and intellectual achievement, shaping tastes across the empire. Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism coexisted with imported religious ideas, enriching the spiritual landscape. The Tang Dynasty's cosmopolitan character ensured that its influence extended beyond China, shaping Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Its achievements became a benchmark for civilization, demonstrating that cultural and intellectual dominance could outlast political collapse. The late Tang period demonstrates the dual nature of empires. They can inspire awe and creativity while simultaneously harboring the seeds of decline. The dynasty's earlier balance of military, administrative, and cultural power allowed for its golden age. Its later dependence on personal loyalty, factional alliances, and regional autonomy sowed vulnerability. The dynasty survived through remarkable resilience, but the cracks in its foundation were permanent. Political authority weakened, economic pressures intensified, and social unrest became a recurring challenge. The empire's decline was gradual, a slow unraveling that made the brilliance of its earlier centuries all the more poignant. Through this complex interplay of strength and fragility, the Tang dynasty left an enduring legacy. Later dynasties, such as the Song, consciously adopted Tang governance models, civil service systems, and cultural standards, seeking to emulate the successes while avoiding the failures. The dynasty's influence extended across East Asia, from administrative systems to artistic styles, leaving a mark that persisted for centuries. Tang culture became synonymous with sophistication, cosmopolitanism, and intellectual achievement, a standard against which civilizations measured themselves long after the empire's political power waned. The story of the Tang dynasty is not merely one of conquest and governance. It is a story of human ambition, resilience, and creativity. It shows how a civilization can achieve extraordinary heights when vision, strategy, and culture align. It also illustrates the fragility of empires, revealing how imbalance, corruption, and neglect can erode even the most magnificent achievements. The Tang dynasty, in all its contradictions, offers timeless lessons about leadership, the responsibilities of power, and the enduring impact of culture. It remains a testament to what is possible when an empire embraces openness, excellence, and human creativity, and a warning of what can happen when those principles are forgotten. As the Tang dynasty drew closer to its final years, its history became a mosaic of contradictions. On the surface it remained magnificent, a hub of culture, trade, and diplomacy, but beneath the surface political structures were eroding at an alarming rate. Regional military governors wielded growing autonomy, effectively operating as independent rulers. Their armies collected taxes, and personal ambitions increasingly dictated the course of the empire. Central authority had become symbolic rather than practical, and the emperor's decisions were often influenced or overridden by powerful eunuchs and court factions. The Golden Age, that had once dazzled the world, now teetered precariously, sustained more by inertia than by true control. Cultural achievements, however, never waned. Tang poets, artists, and scholars continued to create work that would define Chinese identity for centuries. Du Fu's reflective poetry chronicled societal suffering and moral decay, capturing the emotional landscape of a society in transition. Li Bai's vibrant verse celebrated imagination, freedom, and the transcendence of human creativity, offering a counterpoint to the somber realities of political decline. Their works revealed that culture could flourish even as political power faltered, and that art could immortalize a civilization even as its institutions crumbled. Trade and diplomacy remained crucial to Tang influence. Chang'an, though periodically destabilized by rebellion, continued to serve as a cosmopolitan center where merchants from Persia, India, Central Asia, and beyond converged. Ideas, technologies, and luxury goods flowed freely along the Silk Road, and the city's cosmopolitan ethos became a model for neighboring states. Japan, Korea, and Vietnam looked to Tang China for administrative systems, legal codes, and cultural refinement. This soft power ensured that the Tang dynasty's legacy endured far beyond its political lifespan. Yet, the empire was increasingly vulnerable. Peasant unrest surged as taxes and forced labor drained rural communities. Banditry and localized uprisings challenged regional governors, whose responses often escalated violence further. Huang Chao's rebellion remained a grim reminder of how devastating internal upheaval could be. The late Tang was a time of constant tension, where the survival of the dynasty depended as much on political maneuvering and compromise as on military force. Its decline was not marked by sudden collapse, but by the gradual erosion of authority and the rise of decentralized power. The late Tang period teaches critical lessons about the impermanence of empires. The dynasty's early success under rulers like Taizong was built on a delicate balance: military strength, civil administration, and cultural investment. Once that balance shifted, even the most powerful dynasty became vulnerable. The concentration of power in regional governors, the manipulation of succession by eunuchs, and the growing corruption within the bureaucracy weakened the foundations of governance. The Tang dynasty's slow decline demonstrates that cultural and military achievements alone cannot sustain an empire indefinitely. Institutional stability and balanced authority are essential. Despite political fragility, the Tang dynasty's cultural and intellectual legacy endured. Its literature, art, and urban sophistication set a benchmark for future dynasties. Trade, diplomacy, and cultural integration influenced neighboring nations for centuries. Even after the dynasty's final emperor abdicated in 907, the ideals of Tang governance, cosmopolitanism, and artistic excellence shaped the trajectory of East Asian civilization. Tang culture became a standard against which rulers and scholars measured themselves, ensuring that the dynasty's achievements remained influential long after its political power had waned. The story of the Tang dynasty is a testament to both human ambition and the fragility of greatness. It illustrates how vision, strategy, and culture can align to create an extraordinary civilization, and how quickly even the most successful empire can unravel when internal balance is lost. Its golden age serves as both inspiration and warning, a reminder that the brightest achievements are fleeting, and that preserving greatness requires constant vigilance, wisdom, and adaptation. The Tang dynasty's enduring influence proves that cultural and intellectual brilliance can outlast political decline, leaving a legacy that continues to captivate the world centuries later. The final chapter of the Tang dynasty is a story of both closure and enduring legacy. By the late 9th and early 10th centuries, the empire had become a complex web of regional powers, court factions, and military governors, each wielding authority in their own sphere. The emperor, once the ultimate source of centralized power, had become a symbolic figure, his decisions filtered through eunuchs, ministers, and regional commanders. The administrative and military brilliance that had created the Golden Age was now constrained by competing ambitions, structural weaknesses, and centuries of accumulated privilege. What remained was a dynasty in survival mode, still magnificent in its cultural expression, but politically fragile. The challenges the Tang faced were numerous and intertwined. Huang Chao's rebellion, which devastated northern China decades earlier, had shown the consequences of social unrest, mismanaged taxation, and military overreach. Peasant uprisings, banditry, and local revolts became increasingly common, while ambitious military governors maintained private armies and collected their own revenues. Central authority was further eroded by palace intrigues and eunuch dominance, who could control the flow of information and manipulate imperial succession. The Golden Age's foundational balance between military power, civil administration, and cultural advancement was unraveling. Yet the cultural brilliance of the Tang continued to thrive. Chang'an remained a beacon of civilization, its streets filled with merchants, artisans, and travelers from across Eurasia. Trade along the Silk Road brought wealth, ideas, and foreign influence, reinforcing the city's cosmopolitan identity. Buddhist temples, Taoist monasteries, Confucian academies, and foreign religious centers flourished alongside one another, creating a spiritual and intellectual diversity rare in history. Tang art, calligraphy, poetry, and literature continued to inspire generations, even as the political structure that had nurtured them weakened. The works of Du Fu, Li Bai, and other luminaries remained timeless, capturing both the beauty and the sorrow of an empire that was slowly slipping from centralized control. The late Tang period illustrates the paradox of imperial power. The same strength that create a golden age, effective governance, cultural investment, and economic prosperity can become vulnerabilities if institutions are not maintained and authority is decentralized. Military governors, once indispensable for frontier defense, became semi-autonomous rulers whose loyalties were negotiable. Eunuchs and factions gained influence, sometimes manipulating emperors to serve their interests. The bureaucracy, originally meritocratic, became susceptible to corruption and nepotism. These systemic weaknesses ensured that the dynasty's decline was inevitable, even as its cities, trade networks, and culture remained vibrant. Internationally, the Tang dynasty's influence persisted. Neighboring states such as Japan, Korea, and Vietnam continued to adopt Tang administrative systems, ceremonial protocols, and cultural norms. Tang art and literature traveled far beyond China's borders, setting standards for aesthetics and intellectual achievement across East Asia. Even after the dynasty's final political collapse in 907, these ideals continued to shape governance, education, and cultural identity in the region. Tang China became a model not just for political organization, but for the very concept of civilization itself, a standard that endured far longer than the dynasty's rule. The dynasty's final decades revealed profound lessons about the nature of human civilization. The Tang dynasty achieved greatness through vision, strategic leadership, and a careful balance between military, administrative, and cultural power. Yet even the most sophisticated empire can collapse when internal checks weaken, personal ambitions override public interest, and systemic balance is lost. Its story is a reminder that golden ages are fragile, their survival dependent not only on talent and vision, but on institutions, foresight, and restraint. Even in its decline, the Tang dynasty remains an extraordinary case study of civilization at its peak. It illustrates how culture can flourish despite political instability, how trade and diplomacy can extend influence far beyond borders, and how intellectual and artistic achievements can outlast even the most powerful rulers. The empire's poets, painters, and thinkers captured the duality of their age, its brilliance and its vulnerability, leaving a legacy that has defined Chinese culture for centuries. When the last Tang emperor abdicated in 907, China fragmented into regional kingdoms. Yet, the memory of the Tang's achievements persisted. Its governance structures, civil service ideals, trade networks and cosmopolitan culture became reference points for subsequent dynasties. Its literature and art were emulated, studied and celebrated. The Tang Dynasty, though politically extinct, achieved a form of immortality. Its golden age continues to inspire, demonstrating that the impact of a civilization is measured not only by territorial conquest or longevity, but by the endurance of its cultural, intellectual and institutional contributions. In conclusion, the Tang Dynasty stands as a timeless symbol of human potential and the fragility of empires. Its rise was built on vision, strategy, and innovation. Its peak was defined by cultural brilliance, economic prosperity, and political sophistication. Its decline reveals the vulnerabilities inherent in complex systems of power, and its legacy demonstrates that even fallen empires can shape the course of history for centuries. The Tang Dynasty teaches us that greatness is both achievable and impermanent, a reminder that civilizations are living, fragile entities, capable of extraordinary achievements yet always at risk of decay. And so, the Tang Dynasty's story ends not with a dramatic conquest or obliteration, but with a slow, inevitable fading of centralized power, while its cultural, intellectual, and institutional brilliance endures. It remains a benchmark of civilization, a symbol of what humanity can achieve when ambition, governance, and culture align, and a lesson in the enduring importance of balance, foresight, and vigilance. History is more than dates and battles. It's the story of human ambition, brilliance, and the choices that shape civilizations. If the rise and fall of the Tang Dynasty fascinated you, imagine what other hidden lessons lie in the stories of empires, heroes, and rebels. Don't let these moments of history fade into the past. Subscribe now, hit the notification bell, and join us as we uncover the secrets, triumphs, and tragedies that shaped the world. Your next journey through history starts here. Don't miss it.